So you really don't make any of them stronger than the others on purpose? Well, maybe I sometimes make one kind of sword sharper than the others. What about the ranged weapons? Oh yeah, I make those sharper too. What? Well, if you ever see a sharp gun barrel, that means I was in a pretty good mood that day. But how does that help? Aerodynamics or something? Yeah, sure, why not? Ladies, gentlemen, and monsters of all ages, we all like our own weapons, of course, but sometimes it is nice to achieve a greater bit of understanding where everything stands when it comes to damage. The weapons are relatively well balanced between each other, at least when put in the hands of an average player, and that is the way that it should be. Nothing should be ridiculously stronger than anything else, because then people might play it even though they don't really enjoy it just because they want maximum monster hunting efficiency. That said, there are certain ends of the skill spectrum where differences make themselves particularly apparent, most notably among speedrunners. So today we'll be going over the rankings of how each weapon performs in those scenarios, absolutely maximized to the brim and put in the hands of people willing to run the same monster over and over again until their hands are bleeding just to reach absolute perfection. First, a little bit of a thank you to Fox Invictus for making this graph. Check out their channel for more Monster Hunter and speedrunning related content, as well as an absolute well of switch axe knowledge if you want to learn more about that weapon. So before we dive into the rankings themselves, let's talk a little bit about what this graph will actually mean. This is an average of the amount of damage done per second within official speedruns, which gives us an accurate representation of how good each weapon can be in its ideal scenario. But there are some factors worth considering. Firstly, some weapons have a lot more people submitting speedruns for them, and these weapons will have more accurate results as they have a larger sample to derive from. Alternatively, weapons that don't get a lot of love in this community will wind up with relatively weaker times just as a result. On top of this, generally you won't see a speedrun posted for a monster that a weapon is bad against. For example, bowguns will tend to stick with bigger monsters that are big enough for pierce ammo to take full effect, and so these rankings shouldn't really be seen as overarching, indisputable, this weapon is the best and this one is the worst. It should all be taken with a couple of grains of salt, as I've mentioned so far.
I don't take anything you say at face value.
That said, this is just a bit of fun and to give you a general idea of how each weapon performs in ideal scenarios. Let's begin then at the top of the list with the heavy bowgun. Surprise, surprise, ranged weapons under ideal conditions absolutely beat the hell out of monsters. It makes sense when you think about it. As I mentioned, pierce ammo on larger creatures does absolute wonders, and considering this graph is based around damage per second, it specifically works out the length of the speedrun versus the health of the monster killed. And, well, there are some pretty notable runs out there of the final boss being beaten down by bowguns in under 2 minutes, which is a ridiculous amount of health in ridiculous speed. Of course, pierce ammo and elemental pierce ammo are the reason most of this is possible, giving an insane amount of damage when done right. And put on top of that, the new switch skills heavy bowgun got in Sunbreak, and it just does even more damage than it did in base Rise. It's just even more effective. After that comes the bow, the next ranged weapon. Bow absolutely excels when played with elemental weaknesses considered of the target you're fighting, and it just fires out a buttload of arrows in no time flat, so the more hits you get, the better, especially when it comes to element. As well, in Sunbreak we had a couple of changes to the weapon that made its ideal playstyle just even stronger, the biggest one being super critical range as an option, which just increases your shot damage if you're standing at the ideal distance from the monster, which is something that an average player may struggle to get the most out of, but to someone at a speedrunner's skill level, this is basically just extra damage to every single shot, making it just better. Third then, we have the light bowgun. This one excels for pretty much the same reasons as the heavy bowgun, the ammo type still being extremely good against specific targets, and like the bow, this weapon also got a super critical range switch skill added in, which can make certain ammo even stronger when used in the right situations. Then in fourth, the highest DPS of a non-ranged weapon, we have the Great Sword. This probably doesn't really come as much of a surprise to anyone given how Great Sword gameplay has changed in Sunbreak. It's now heavily based around using strong arm stance to counter an attack and then follow it with a supercharged heavy damage true charge slash for thousands and thousands of damage. And of course, the better you are at the game, the more often you can pull this off, and thus in speedrun context, this attack is absolutely insanely good, with it only being limited by your ability to pull off the timing and positioning to make it work.
The skill of anticipation.
Coming up next then we have the Switch Axe. This weapon has seen quite a bump in Rise, with elements as a whole becoming stronger. The element Switch Axes have also just gotten way better as a way to play the game in Sunbreak. And on top of that, Switch Axe got a new Silkbind, which is a counter that fully activates amped sword mode in one go, increasing the pace of Switch Axe gameplay significantly. If you are good with that counter, then your hunt speed increases dramatically, and again we see an instance where a weapon gained more skill-based moves, and it became stronger in the hand of the people who are good at using skill-based skill-based moves, no doubt about it. Past this, the remaining weapons are all somewhat clumped up. Heavy bowgun is significantly above any other weapon in the game, then it is a bit of a steady decline down to the switch axe, and then from there there's another small drop, but then everything from here downwards is within a few percentage points of each other, not a whole lot of variance. That said, next up we have the sword and shield, which has been performing quite nicely in Sunbreak. This is less due to changes in Sunbreak specifically and just the way this weapon has worked since base Rise. Metsu Shoryugeki is still an extremely strong attack, a great counter move, and Perfect Rush is a high DPS combo to use on a monster if you can get all of the hits in on a weak spot. Other than that, your general weapon attacks are pretty good and you have some decent options when it comes to playing around element or raw weapons as well. It becomes nicely personal choice. Then, tied for the 7th position today, we have the Charge Blade, which has gone up a decent bit since base Rise, mostly due to the improvement in elemental playstyles. The spinning slash style of gameplay is sometimes better against a lot of monsters, but even then you want to use a weapon with matching element to your target's weakness, as even that playstyle is just a ton of hits in a short amount of time. Regardless of that, elemental SAED is now popping off now as well, making the weapon a lot stronger than it was in base Rise, especially when you consider the hitboxes of this attack being tightened in this game and made much more likely to actually hit the monster with its full damage properly. Then tied with that we have the Longsword, which is considerably lower than it has been in the past. This is mostly due to the way that the weapon was changed here in Rise and then Sunbreak. EI Spirit Slash in Sunbreak being nerfed heavily to keep it from becoming overpowered with the Harvest Moon Circle of Effect, the new Silkvine, but it was sort of overdone, especially when you consider that Harvest Moon is quite hard to use in an actual hunting scenario, as most monsters move around too much for you to actually stay in such a tiny circle. Sacred Sheath has a massive amount of damage that you can pull out, but it consumes every level of your spirit gauge in one go, and so it is simply a less ideal way of getting to your maximum damage. Longsword has gotten far more options than it had in the past, different kinds of playstyles, but the result of that is that its absolute peak is not only harder to reach, but just a little bit lower than it used to be. Then we get to the Insect Glaive, which has seen a reasonable bump in damage, not due to a new switch skill or Silkbind, but due to a new base part of the weapon itself, specifically a special move that can be done when using a powder kinsect called Powder Vortex. This attack sucks in all the powder in an area and does a massive blast for easily over 1000 damage, and this augment to the standard Insect Glaive playstyle has just added a ton of damaging ability to the weapon. On top of this, Sunbreak added Chain Crit as a skill which increases your damage if you can successfully keep up more than 5 hits in a row without stopping, and Insect Glaive is just one of the better weapons of the game at doing that in general.
Just never stops, huh?
Next up then we come to Dual Blades, which actually surprises me a bit. Dual Blades feel extremely strong to use these days, but I guess the reason that it doesn't blow speedrun times out of the water is simply due to how it has been changed in Sunbreak. For the most part, Dual Blades has been given more reasons to play both elementally and to play raw. Its changes have given it more variation rather than just made one playstyle ungodly strong. The Sunbreak changes, more than anything, just gave you more comfort rather than more power, and so the weapon winds up being pretty middling when it comes to a speedrunning context. Number 11 then today is my personal main, the Hunting Horn. This one makes sense to me in its positioning. The weapon is quite good, but it doesn't have a proper counter option, which means that its skill ceiling itself isn't ridiculously high. We gained Sonic Bloom as an offensive option in Sunbreak, but this mostly just scales with raw, and it's pretty easy to use, meaning that it's more of a raising the floor than a raising the ceiling type of thing. Whereas the top end of Hunting Horn builds these days are also elementally based, which doesn't really affect Sonic Bloom. The weapon is performing well, but not insanely well, and that is sort of where Hunting Horn should be realistically, given its ability to completely overpower a group hunt. Keep in mind that all of this data is from solo hunts, so it doesn't count the amount of difference that a Horn player can have on 3 other hunters in a multiplayer scenario. After that, we then come to Gunlance, which isn't last. Look, I know it doesn't sound like a massive victory, but Gunlance has struggled a bit in comparison to other weapons in this context for a while, and the main reason for that is how far the weapon is weighted towards its shelling damage, and shelling damage doesn't care about monster hit zones. This means in order to make this somewhat balanced, the developers have always had to keep the shelling damage somewhat low to avoid people just running around shelling the hardest part of a monster for more damage than another player playing a different weapon who hits the weakest spot all the time. Then, essentially tied with that, we have the Lance. The Lance is great at persistent damage, never stopping, always poking, and always doing decent damage when it does. Somewhat like Gunlance's weapon's strength is in its ability to stay in the fight always, consistently, rather than its ability to hit off massive chunks of damage in a single go, and that sort of makes it worse in a speedrun context, as most other weapons really shine in speedruns because speedrunners are able to maximize their ability to keep uptime, to stay within the fight. But because Lance just sort of does that by default, there's not a whole lot of room for growth here, and so it just doesn't gain a massive amount. That said, this is also one of the lesser played weapons by speedrunners, and so it just has less results in general to draw from. Then finally, the last weapon in the power rankings today, we sadly have the hammer. I love the hammer, and personally I prefer the way that it played in Iceborne to the way it does now. In fact, I mained the weapon back then, but it is still sad to see it all the way at the bottom of this list. It has gained a bit of an elemental playstyle in Sunbreak that does decently well, but clearly not well enough to put it higher on the graph. And the raw playstyle, while decent, just doesn't have any ways in which to really shoot it up the damage charts. Sort of like how some other weapons were upgraded in ways that make both the raw and elemental playstyles viable, hammer was, and it also made it so neither one of them particularly shines. Every weapon in Sunbreak is good, every weapon is capable of doing loads of damage, but in an ideal situation in the hands of a speedrunner, hammer just sort of comes out looking the worst. Sorry, hammer. And that's just about it. What do you all think about this? Where does your weapon stand, and how do you think about these speedrun DPS rankings compared to your experiences in actual hunts? When you're in multiplayer, do you seem to be doing the most damage in the party even when you're using a hammer? Because the main thing to keep in mind here is that everything is sort of relative to both the skill and the situation. Certain monsters are way more suited to specific weapons than others, and some weapons also just have a much higher skill ceiling than other ones do, meaning that the better you are with the weapon, the more damage you can get out of it. At the end of the day, every weapon in Sunbreak is fun, and that's what matters most, but I hope you've all enjoyed this look into the higher end of things, the theoretical way of ranking the weapons by actual statistics rather than just feeling around with them like the way I normally tend to do. Like if you like the video, subscribe and hit the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.